Hello guys, welcome to ADB Tech channel. Today we'll talk about Spring Boot. So if you see our agenda, what is Spring Boot? Spring Boot versus Spring MVC, Spring Boot features, some starter dependencies, important annotations. So let's move to next slide. What is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is basically an extension of the Spring framework, which eliminates the boilerplate configurations required for setting up a Spring application. So normally, if you see Spring Boot, definition in that is Spring Boot website, you can see this. Spring Boot makes it easy to create standalone production grade Spring based applications that you can just run. So it means so if you create a Spring Boot application, right? So you don't need to deploy Spring Boot application in any external server. So because Spring Boot provides you inbuilt server like Tomcat, JT. So that's what it means, like standalone application and the production grade, Spring based applications. It means it will give you like a production ready application. It means you can automatically deploy our application and it will give you some metrics, health checkup, health rest your APIs, everything it will provide you by default. So you don't need to worry much on this. So that's what it is. And we take an opinionated view of the Spring platform. So opinionated, we'll talk about in upcoming slides. So this is like the basic definition. So normally Spring Boot is a like lightweight framework. So it's on top of Spring MVC. It's built on. Okay. So if you move to next slide, so Spring Boot versus Spring MVC. So before talking the differences between these two, so we'll talk about little on Spring MVC. So Spring MVC is a web-based framework that provides a three-tier architecture called model view controller. So in this, model component handles the application data, view component handles the presentation layer, controller component handles the incoming request, creates proper models, and returns appropriate request to the view. So in Spring MVC, if you create any project, so we need to do more XML configurations. Like you have to add every each and every dependencies. So there are lot of configurations would be there in Spring MVC. So if you talk about Spring Boot, so you don't need to write these XML configurations here. So it eliminates this XML configuration in Spring Boot. It's very lightweight. So that's why we moving to Spring Boot to applications architecture. In Spring Boot, normally it is a microservice architecture it is to follow. So we'll talk about microservice architecture later. Like let's move to our next slide. So if you see Spring Boot features, so if you talk about Spring Boot features, we will get to know like the differences between Spring Boot and Spring MVC frameworks. So if you see the first point, create standalone Spring application. As we talked earlier, so we don't need to deploy Spring Boot applications in any external server. So it will provide you inbuilt servers, like you can see embedded Tomcat, Jetty, or under Tau. So you don't have to create any war files. So you can create jar only. So automatically it will deploy into the internal server and you can access that your URLs. So it means like you can even deploy Spring Boot applications in external servers, but it's not required. So because if you wanted to test any Spring Boot, applications like any REST services, so what you need to do, you should deploy our applications into any external servers. Like then we can test our REST APIs. But in here in Spring Boot, you can just create in a few minutes in a REST service. You can expose it, and you can test immediately because it will give you production ready application, right? That's what we talked earlier. And if you see the other point, provide opinionated starter dependencies to simplify your build configuration. So it means opinionated view. It means, for example, if you added Spring Boot starter data JPA dependency in your Maven project. So what Spring Boot will do? So it by default it will create in-memory database and Hibernate manager, and it will create data source for you. So you don't need to worry about these things actually. This is what we call it as a opinionated view. in Spring Boot. And if you see the other point, automatically configure Spring and third-party libraries whenever possible. And the other point is provide production ready features such as metrics, health checks, and externalized configuration. So it means if you add, there is a one dependency called actuator. So Spring Boot starter actuator. If you add that dependency in your application, so you can get this, REST APIs by default. So metrics, you can check your application metrics, and health checks the server, runnings or it is stopped or not, and externalized configurations. And the other point, if you see, absolutely no code generation and no requirement for XML configuration. So we don't need to do any XML configurations here. So here very less coding we will do for normal one startup application. So these are the Spring Boot features. If you move to next slide, so Spring Boot starter dependencies. So these are the some of the dependencies actually. So if you see Spring Boot starter data JPA, this is for database connectivity and repository management we can do. I mean the database repositories thing. And if you see Spring Boot starter security, this is for like security purpose we can use. And Spring Boot starter test. So this is like you wanted to create any JUnit test cases, we'll use this starter dependency. And we have Spring Boot starter web. So it's basically a web application. And if starter web is there, so you can create even REST services. And the other one is Spring Boot starter timey leaf. So this one is for UI component actually. So basically Spring Boot we will use for microservice purpose, right? So we only create services, but if you want, you can create UI as well. So these are the some of the starter dependencies. Okay, if you move to other slide, you can see Spring Boot annotations. So these are the major annotations. So you can see at the Spring Boot application. At the Spring Boot application is the main annotation in Spring Boot. So it is like combination of three annotations like at the enable auto configuration, at the component scan, and at the configuration. It means like by default Spring Boot, you know, add you like automatically the default, the beans, it will instantiate for you. So you don't need to create manually, it automatically instantiate you. And the component scan will, what it will do is it will scan your packages. Inside packages, whatever the classes, services, interfaces which you created, it will scan in your application. And at that configuration, you can use for any database configurations, creations, and all, we can use this annotation. So you can use these three annotations on top of the class. Otherwise, you can directly use Spring Boot application. This is the class level annotations actually. And if you see even at the controller, at the REST controller, these two we can use for creating REST services. And you can see at the request mapping to provide the URI. And you can see at the get mapping and at the post mapping. So these are the some of the annotations which we used to use. This is the basic introduction of Spring Boot. So thank you guys for watching this video. So in my upcoming videos, I'll provide you, how to create Spring Boot application by using Spring Boot initializer, Spring initializer, and by using Eclipse, I can show you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.